Hey guys! Today I wanted to do a brief showcase of the Sword Master for the female Slayer class. I'll be covering things like general playstyle, tips and tricks for some notable skills, talisman recommendations, some example rotations, and some gearing guidelines for endgame optimization. To start, Sword Master is an exceptionally versatile pure dealer and deals physical percentage damage, meaning she scales with strength and physical attack. So you'll want to reinforce your weapon and not refine it. Straight to skills, starting with her masteries. Now, Sword Master actually has 4 different playstyles depending on which weapon you choose. Generally speaking, Zanbato is the most common and most popular. I would say Bludgeon is probably the least popular. Short Sword is actually not maybe popular, but viable. And Katana is actually incredibly powerful, but also probably one of the hardest playstyles in the entire game. And I'll go through all of those, one at a time, starting with Zanbato. So Zanbato is mostly about super armor and charging. That's really all it is. Basically, you gain super armor on Sliding Slash even for some utility. You get super armor during Flash, which is this move right here. Very, very nice. And Crescent grants super armor and attacks once instead of multiple times. Normally, Crescent will hit 3 times, like that. But with the Mastery, it'll only be 1 hit. And you get super armor. And this is very, very nice for clearing an entire room of enemies. Very high DPS as well. And Swift Demon Slash, when you fully charge it now, the finisher will deal increased damage and have much more range. But most importantly, using a charge skill will grant you a range bonus, but more importantly, a skill attack bonus. I can showcase this real quick. By using Flash doing 33,000 damage, but if I gain my passive here, which doesn't actually display the skill attack, if I re-flash here, it'll do 48,000 damage. So it's very, very important that you maintain this 30-second duration buff at all times to do maximum damage. That's really all the playstyle boils down to, is just super armor and charging. Next, we'll move on to Bludgeon. Bludgeon is actually very interesting. It's all about shock waves. And basically, you give yourself this passive, just like Zanbato gets skill attack on charging. For Bludgeons, it's on shockwave. So things like Mountain Press gives you this Bludgeon skill attack increase. Tossing Slash, that finisher. Things like Illusion Slash, and finally Arcane Sword Blast. These will give you this Bludgeon Mastery buff and refresh it. And that's really all it is. The entire playstyle revolves around your Illusion Sword and bursting with Arcane Sword Blast. Otherwise, it's the exact same thing. Moving on to Short Sword. Now, this one's actually very unique. Short Sword is all about something called Magic Sword Medley, which is a passive skill based on your elemental shift. And what this does is, depending on what element you're on, you'll shoot out these different attacks. So on water, for example, it'll be this Ice Spear. On Shadow, it'll be these Shadow Explosions. On Fire, it'll be these Fire Rings that deal AoE damage as well. And then on Light, you'll have these Lightning Bolts that also have some AoE. And as you can see, I have this sword behind me right here. Short Sword Mastery, instead of giving you a buff depending on some kind of proc, basically it just gives you a skill bonus, an attack bonus, while using a short sword, when you have 2 elemental shifts. Generally speaking, you would go, say, like Shadow and Water, or you can go Fire and Light, in whatever order you choose. And this is due to dual enchants giving fire and light, or water and shadow. There are some exceptions to that rule, however. And basically that's about it. Every time you use an attack, you'll be able to proc Magic Sword Medleys. They will also have a lower cooldown, so they happen more frequently. And they also proc off of your Imperial Swordsmanship. So for example, if I'm on Shadow and Water, they will happen together. The Shadow Explosions and the Ice Spears. And this will happen on all your skills. However, not your basic attacks. Although sometimes there's a bug where it will proc on basic attacks when you backstep in a party, and sometimes solo. Kind of strange. And for Katana, finally, Katana is a totally different playstyle. It's all about canceling now. So Elemental Shift also gets a buff. It'll actually do a significant amount of damage if you max it. But more importantly, you have a passive called Blade Dance, which gives you stacks, just like Muscle Shift for strikers, where you can cancel skills to change to other ones. You can consume these stacks right here, not this one right here, I'm sorry. You can cancel abilities to use them more quickly. But Katana has some interesting bonuses on things like Crescent and Swift Demon Slash, as well as Flash. Flash now shoots an additional sword at the end if you cancel it. Right there, that big one at the end. Pretty cool, extra damage. Crescent, normally you have to charge to get all the hits in, but if you cancel into it, it just is automatically charged right away. Swift Demon Slash, same thing. If you charge it, it performs a finisher, but if you're using Katana, if you cancel into it, it'll automatically perform the charged version. And Katana can be very, very engaging to play because it becomes very, very fast-paced now with all the canceling. But timing is very important. So for example, like that, if you do it too slowly, you will not get the cancel and lose all the skill attack bonuses. Which is a staggering 34% damage at level 30 Katana Mastery. And if you miss this cancel, you lose out on that skill attack bonus. So you have to be very, very fast with your cancels. But it can be cancelled into from your Imperial Swordsmanship as well. And now you might be like, hey, wait a minute, you have a limited number of cancels, won't you run out? Actually, for Katanas, you will actually just recover Blade Dance stacks as you hit enemies repeatedly, every combo. Very, very cool. Now moving on, I want to talk about Elemental Shift. The 4 elements, if you choose one element here, you will in fact gain the Inflict. So for example, right now I have no Elemental Inflict on my weapon, but if I want to inflict water, I'll use the Ice Sword, and now I do inflict water damage on all of my skills and my attacks. Same with Shadow, Light, and of course, Fire. And then finally, I want to talk about the actual skills now. Crescent, like I mentioned before, Crescent is normally a 3-hit skill, but if you do not charge it, it does way less damage. So for example, if I just raw cast it, that did 6,000 damage, not a whole lot. But if I charge it, 7,254 damage, quite a bit more. If I'm closer to the enemy, and I get 3 hits in, 10,800 damage, etc. And so that is very, very key. And so for Crescent, you do absolutely want to charge it whenever possible to increase the damage. It doesn't take very, very long. You'll see an effect on the character itself. Gain that little spark, and you're good to go. Moving on to Swift Demon Slash, just like Crescent, it can be charged. And then you'll get this finisher at the end, which does a lot of damage. However, if you do not charge it, you get fewer slashes and no finisher. Or, well, a much weaker finisher, technically. So, absolutely charge the skill all the way. whenever you get the chance. It does not take very long at all. Moving on to Unleash. Unleash also can be charged, but it is not quite the same as the other ones. When you charge Unleash, instead of doing bonus damage altogether, you get more of these multi-hits early on before you fire it. Otherwise, you get one hit and then a bunch of multi-hits, but if you hold it, you get some additional multi-hits at the start of the skill. So for example, if you just let it rip, 47,000 damage, but if you hold it, 55,800 damage. Again, not mandatory, but recommended whenever you have the chance. Next I want to talk about Blade Waltz. Blade Waltz is kind of interesting. Normally, when you fully channel it, it looks like this. It is very incredibly slow, but it can be sped up. If you mash the key and mash your attack key, it is way faster. But that's not all. This can actually be cancelled out of. If you cancel into another skill with Blade Dance, all the swords, all these individual swords will just blow up at any point. Like that. Now, this sounds like a very nice bonus, but you do lose out on the finisher then. So what happens is, for example, a fully channeled Blade Waltz will do 92,857 damage, but a cancelled one will do 76,000 damage, which is much less. However, you have to consider the fact that you are spending way less time animating the skill, and you are not actually invulnerable during this skill's animation. You are only super armored. You can't be interrupted out of it, you can be cancelled out of it, you can just miss the skill entirely, the finisher might not land. So you absolutely should weigh your options. Generally speaking, you will almost always be cancelling and using other skills instead. But if you get a chance and you just don't have any other skills available, you can just fully channel this for maximum damage if you'd like. Next, I also want to talk about Elemental Eradicator. Very similar. This skill is also very slow, but you can speed it up by mashing the skill key or the attack key. And then finally, I want to talk about Blade Dance timing. So canceling skills seems very intuitive, and it does feel intuitive, but you have to be very careful with your timing. Otherwise, you may cancel skill animations when they're not even over yet. So, for example, Swift Demon Slash, if you cancel it before the finisher, obviously you're going to lose out on the finisher. Unleash, if you cancel too early, will just fizzle and just go away. You want to make sure you actually fire out the Unleash before you cancel that skill, or maybe not even cancel out of it altogether. Flash, if you cancel too early, you do not get the additional hits. Crescent, for example, on not Zanbato, if you cancel too early, you lose the multi-hits. Elemental Eradicator can actually not exactly be cancelled right away. However, if you have the Talisman for it, which I'll showcase later, you can absolutely cancel too soon. And then Blade Waltz, of course, you can cancel at any point, but you do lose damage because you don't land the finisher. And finally, Arcane Sword Blast has a long animation. If you cancel it before this final slam, it just fizzles. And lastly, Ultimate Magic Sword Wind Wheel. This is notorious. This is a relatively long animation skill, which is actually really cool. But if you cancel out of it before the finisher actually explodes, the skill does fizzle. You want to wait for the explosion before you cancel into another skill. Otherwise, the explosion will just not occur. And finally, we can move on to Talismans. Starting with the ones I have equipped now, I have Swift Demon Slash. This is very strong for Zanbato. I have Crescent, also very strong for Zanbato. And Elemental Eradicator is going to be a universal utility pick for all 4 weapon types. And I'll show you why. Elemental Eradicator is actually extremely useful because instead of channeling the entire ability, now you fire out all the swords and they just happen automatically. They become an installation skill. Very cool. However, you have to actually let the animation happen where you throw out the sword. Right there. If you cancel this too quickly, the skill fizzles. So please make sure you perform this animation over your cancel right here, and then it's safe. Otherwise, you will just lose out on all that damage. Next, I want to talk about Swift Demon Slash. So it says use draw sword before the finishing attack to auto-cast the attack. This is actually a mistranslation. The draw sword is supposed to be Blade Dance, which actually has the same exact name in Korean as the Weapon Master skill draw sword. So what this means is, instead of fully channeling for the finisher, you can instead now cancel it at the right time, and the finisher will happen automatically. And this is great for not having to channel this extra bit at the end. So you can just wait for that animation and cancel to another skill. But as you can see, the damage does increase by quite a bit. A lot of the damage gets front-loaded into the finisher, and the range gets increased by a massive 30%. This is gigantic for Zanbato. And Crescent Talisman, instead of increasing the damage of the actual slash portion, will shoot out a ranged Spirit Sword. And that is where the damage increase comes from. The range does also get increased by 30%, which is very, very nice. And with a Zanbato, this range is gigantic. But always make sure you are facing the enemy. So for example, if I use Crescent this way, even though the slash portion will land, the Spirit Sword will not. You'll see that does 20,000 damage. But if I face the enemy, 27,000 damage. So make sure you are facing the enemy that you actually want to land the skill on. And moving on to the other talismans, Arcane Sword Blast is actually very important for Bludgeon, as it does an insane amount of DPS. And with Bludgeon especially, Arcane Sword Blast becomes this animation, where all the swords get stacked on top of each other and explode all together. And the talisman will increase the number of swords, therefore increase the number of explosions and damage, and the range gets increased by 40%. And Blade Waltz is actually kind of interesting because it actually adds the finisher's damage into the cancelled explosions, which is nice, but not really necessary. The DPS is still on the lower side, and it's kind of a good flex pick for Bludgeon or possibly Short Sword, but otherwise it's not preferred. Dragon Mortar is not great. The DPS is okay, the damage is also alright. It actually increases the cooldown, and it changes the animation. The range becomes narrower. There is an explosion, but you have to actually land the skill, and I would say this is just not a recommended talisman to use. Even if you get this to drop, you might not even want to use it. And then finally, Unleash. Unleash is actually very strong, and this is actually a great pick for all the weapon types. However, it can be a little awkward to use because you do lose the multi-hits. You just fire it forward, and this can be actually a problem when you're using it in melee range, and it can sometimes just go right through an enemy and just miss the skill entirely. So based on each weapon type, for Zanbato specifically, generally speaking, you're going to want Swift Demon Slash, Crescent, and Elemental Eradicator. You can use Unleash. And for runes, you can use Swift Demon Slash or Crescent. Crescent is technically higher DPS, and Swift Demon Slash is more about burst damage. That's completely up to your playstyle and your build. For Katana, I would actually recommend the exact same setup with either Swift Demon Slash or Crescent runes. However, Flash runes are probably the preferred choice. And Eradicator, of course, is still just a really good utility pick, reducing your animation time. For Bludgeon, I would say Arcane Sword Blast is your most important talisman, and I would go Arcane Sword Blast runes as well. And you can pair this with things like Swift Demon Slash, Elemental Eradicator, Blade Waltz, even Unleash. Kind of up to you there. And for Short Sword, generally speaking, you can go Elemental Eradicator for the utility, Blade Waltz for added utility, Unleash is a pretty good pick, Crescent is really good, and of course Swift Demon Slash is also very, very strong. Those are my recommended choices for Short Sword. For runes, you can go basically whatever you want. Crescent is very high DPS. You can use Unleash if you'd like. Hell, you could go Elemental Eradicator for all I care. So getting into rotations, I'll be doing Zanbato only. This is my skill build. I have Spare SP and Sliding Slash just for utility. It does give me extra slashes. Lunar Sword, Flash, Crescent, Magic Sword mainly for Unleash damage, Flip Demon Slash, etc. My TPs look like this: Eradicator, Swift Demon Slash, Crescent, Flash, Lunar Sword, and Basic Training. And for this rotation, I'll be doing a 30-second rotation on a sandbag. No speed, no consumables, just this. And some things to note: Flash and Crescent have 16.5 second cooldowns. I'll be able to use these twice. Unleash also has a 27.5 second cooldown. If I start my rotation with this, I should be able to get a second one at the end. Lunar Sword has an 8.8 second cooldown. I'll be able to get 3 of these, no problem. But everything else is over 30 seconds, so I will not be able to get multiple in. Arcane Sword Blast can be used at the start and at the end, but the animation time is quite high, and generally speaking, the damage from just using Imperial Swordsmanship will match or outdo Arcane Sword Blast, unless you have enough skill level bonuses into the skill. So let's do it. Unleash, Crescent, Flash, then just go into the other skills, fully charge that. Go for my skills here. That's it. Nothing special. Then you'll see Unleash, 2 uses did do a lot of damage. Windwheel did a lot of damage. Crescent did a lot of damage for just 2 uses. Swift Demon Slash obviously does a lot of damage with Zanbato. Eradicator is pretty good. 2 flashes, also a lot of damage. A fully channeled Blade Waltz did a lot of damage. However, if I cancelled it, it would be absolutely lower, around the same damage as 3 Lunar Swords. That's about it. However, Talismans and actual gear will change this quite a bit, especially since a lot of Sword Masters will actually use Crossroad Shoes. And so for Crossroad Shoes, I'll be using Swift Demon Slash in slot 1, Crescent in slot 2, and Eradicator in slot 3, with full Swift Demon Slash runes. Can of course use Crescent runes instead. This is just my preferred playstyle. Okay, same thing, but this time with Talismans. I will be giving myself 60% attack speed and use these potions: Undiluted Strength, Mind Stimulant Potion, and Warlords. Some things to note for this rotation: I have no cooldown reduction in my build currently, but I am using Crossroads. I will absolutely be able to get 2 Swift Demon Slashes, and also at least 3 if not 4 Crescents. And same thing as last time, I will be able to use Flash 3 times this time because of Mind Stimulant, and using Lunar Sword periodically. But of course, Blade Waltz, this time I will not fully channel it, and cancel it for the sake of animation time. So let's go straight in. Gonna wait for Flash here and Crescent. And that's it. And now you can see with Crossroad Shoes, Swift Demon Slash does an enormous amount of damage with 2 uses. Even at just 1 cast, it's doing 72 million damage. That's still at the top. Third Awakening, decent amount. 3 Crescents, a lot of damage. If I got a 4th one in, that would have been way more. Second Awakening, still quite strong because I am using Crossroads Belt. Eradicator, pretty strong. 3 Flashes actually quite strong. 2 Unleashes, pretty good. And that's about it. Nothing too spectacular. Dragon Mortar is not TP'd, so it's not that strong. But still, added damage. And Imperial Swordsmanship, I got 6 uses in. I could have gotten a couple more if I was faster. And it does pretty decent DPS. Now this rotation is for Zanbato only, of course. If you were to use Bludgeon instead, naturally, you will max Arcane Sword Blast and use it 2 or 3 or even 4 times in a rotation. That'll be your main source of damage. Illusion Sword will also do an astounding amount of damage with it. If you were to use a Katana, instead of charging skills like for Zanbato, you'll be canceling skills constantly to get these skill bonuses, so make sure you are using Imperial Swordsmanship or just are timing your cancels correctly. This will be way harder in a rotation, especially in actual content when things can fight back, and it will take a lot of practice, but the damage is absolutely worth it. And finally, for Short Sword, nothing too special. You don't have to do anything different. Basically, all you have to do is use all your skills, and in any downtime, just spam your swordsmanship to proc Magic Sword Deadlies. And that's it. And now moving on to gear guidelines, Crossroads is a very popular setup, especially for Zanbato and Bludgeon because of their specialized bonuses. The shoes in particular increase the damage of your Talisman slot 1 and 2, generally going to be Swift Demon Slash and Crescent for Zanbato, and Arcane Sword Blast, and either Elemental Eradicator or Blade Waltz or anything for slot 2. For Katana and Short Sword, however, a more balanced build is generally more valuable due to their damage spread being less focused on their Talisman skills. Katanas can still use Crossroad shoes, however, a lot of their damage is front-loaded on just their flashes and general damage across the board. And finally, moving on to things like cooldown reduction, one source of cooldown reduction is generally enough. However, 2 sources is not an awful idea if you're using Zanbato or even Bludgeon, as they do innately have higher cooldowns. But you will have much busier rotations and may have trouble actually using all your skills in time. Moving on to Sirocco sets, Assassin is generally the preferred set if you don't have any or enough cooldown reduction. However, if you do have some or enough, you can move to Gatekeeper, which is just going to give you a lot of elemental damage. However, it will be quite expensive as you will generally want all elemental damage enchants, which are very pricey. Next, on the other hand, is a great budget option if you're not willing to shell out the money for Gatekeeper, although it doesn't offer any utility. Moving on to Rhodos. Rhodos is actually a very recommended set, specifically for Katana, as you'll be using something called Taiji Emperor's Sword, although you can use Avant-Garde. Taiji Emperor's Sword on Yang Energy gives a large damage increase at the cost of 50% speed penalty. But Rhodos can offset that penalty by a fair margin by giving you a lot of attack speed and movement speed that do ramp up, and also gives you damage reduction and super armor, and that's very, very nice to have for a playstyle like Katanas, where you're canceling constantly and sticking on the enemy. Rhodos is also viable if you want to use Short Sword, as the extra speed and super armor can be valuable for sticking onto enemies for Magic Sword medley procs. And finally, Roxy is viable if your endgame setup features a lot of bonuses to your awakenings, but is generally not the preferred set as her potential DPS is quite high no matter the weapon type. And that's about it. To recap, the Swordmaster can become a slower paced powerhouse or a much faster paced DPS machine depending on your weapon of choice. Her varied playstyles can make her very engaging to learn and pick up, so try her out and see if any of her weapon playstyles pique your interest. You may end up really liking her. If you have any questions regarding this class, please drop a comment below. You can also join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to below as well. You can also catch me live on Twitch if you'd like to ask me anything directly. I stream almost every day, generally after 5 or 6 p.m. Pacific, so I hope to see you there. Otherwise, have a good one. Cheers, guys.